Hey there. Tonight we're pulling back the heavy velvet curtain on one of the most whispered chapters of English history. Not in a shout, but in a murmur. Not the loud coronations or the trumpet blare of battle, but the quiet collapse of something once great. The kind of story that begins in triumph and ends in stillness. If calm, slow journeys like this help you sleep a little easier, where history tiptoes through candlelit corridors, and every sigh tells a secret, then feel free to subscribe or follow along. No pressure at all. And if you're listening from somewhere far or unexpected, we'd love to know. Leave a comment, letting us know where you're tuning in from. Now take a breath. We're about to begin, not with a king in glory, but with a fall. You hear it before you see it. The thundering rhythm of hooves pounding across frozen earth, the brassy clink of armor meeting armor, and the hushed breath of 1,000 spectators, all drawn to the edge of silence. It's cold this morning. January 24th, 1536. The sky over Greenwich is pale and wide, washed in gray light and layered in frost. You can smell the damp hay, and horses feel the edge of winter tightening around your fingers as you clutch your cloak a little tighter. The king is about to ride, and not just ride, but charge, gallop, tilt, collide. Because today, King Henry VIII, ruler of England, defender of the faith, is determined to prove he still owns the fire of youth. And this morning, it seems, the whole kingdom has gathered just to watch him burn. You're standing at the edge of the tilt yard, the long jousting lane just beyond the stone rail. The snow has melted into soft patches along the packed dirt track, and the royal standard flaps above your head. To your left, courtiers shiver beneath fur-trimmed hoods, hands warmed on goblets of mulled wine. To your right, the Queen Anne Boleyn sits high in the gallery, draped in crimson and tension. Her hand rests lightly on her belly. She is pregnant again, and all of England is holding its breath. Down below, the king mounts his charger. Henry looks magnificent. He still does, even now at 44. Broad-shouldered thick through the chest eyes, sharp beneath the brim of his gilded helmet. His armor, specially commissioned for the occasion, glitters in the pale sunlight. Polished steel engraved with roses, and the Tudor arms inlaid with gold at the edges. Even his horse wears its own glinting barding, a quilted, plated shell fit for a beast, bred to crash through men. Together they look like something out of legend. But legends, like kings, can fall. The signal is given. Across the field, his opponent levels his lance. A hush falls over the crowd. Then comes the roar of hooves, a symphony of movement, the force of two lives charging straight at one another, across a corridor of destiny. And then it happens. A sound like the world tearing in two. Not the clean strike of lance against shield, but a tangled, disastrous collapse. The horses collide in the center. Henry's mount stumbles, rears, then topples sideways, the full weight of its armored body crushing down on the king. Metal groans. Dust flies. And in a blink, the most powerful man in England lies unmoving beneath half a ton of twisted fury. Gasps ripple outward like a shockwave. For a moment, no one moves. The court has frozen mid-breath. Time itself seems to hesitate. Then servants begin to shout. Pages run. Anne rises, one gloved hand pressed to her mouth. Something's gone terribly wrong. The king does not get up. 2 hours pass. No one dares say it aloud, but the question floats above the field like the morning mist. Is the king already dead? What happens to a kingdom when its monarch falls literally completely without warning? For 2 full hours, England lives in limbo. The court hovers in dread. Anne Boleyn waits in a haze of nausea and fear, knowing the fate of her unborn child and herself hangs on what happens next. And then he wakes, but not quite the same. There's no soft return, no humbled recovery. According to witnesses, Henry stirs, blinks, then lashes out in fury. He shouts. He demands to know who stopped the match. Why was the joust called off? Who interrupted his glory? There is no relief in his tone, no gratitude that his neck wasn't broken. Just rage, cold, sudden, disorienting. And something in his eyes, those famously vibrant sky-colored eyes, has dimmed. For much of his early life, Henry had been England's golden Renaissance prince. He danced. He composed music. He played tennis. He debated theology and wrote scathing rebuttals to Martin Luther. He had a talent for languages and a love of finery. His court had been a beacon of learning and poetry. And more than that, he had shown remarkable patience, even kindness for a king. He remained married to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, for over 20 years. He had spared most noble rivals from execution, unlike many medieval rulers before him. But in the months following that fall, something began to shift. The incident at Greenwich likely reopened an old leg wound, one first sustained years earlier during another joust. The re-injury never quite healed. From this point forward, it would trouble him constantly. In truth, it may have been more than just a wound. Some modern historians now believe the accident also caused lasting trauma to Henry's brain, particularly the frontal lobe, which governs impulse control, judgment, and emotion. No scans exist, of course, but the behavioral shift is hard to ignore. The facts line up too neatly. Within months, Anne Boleyn, his second queen, and the mother of the unborn child she carried during the accident, was arrested, accused of treason, and beheaded. Within a year, Henry's trusted advisor, Thomas Cromwell, met a similar fate. The executions, once rare, now flowed with increasing ease. The king's moods became unpredictable laughter, one moment threats the next. One ambassador wrote home that it was as if the king had been touched by something beyond natural understanding. Behind closed doors, those closest to Henry noticed the change too. He became restless, angry, withdrawn. At times he would sit alone for hours in rooms darkened by heavy curtains, speaking to no one. The man who once loved display and pageantry now seemed irritated by noise, overwhelmed by even minor breaches of protocol. He no longer played music. He danced less. His appetite grew, but his joy somehow diminished. And yet, still he was king. Still he held court, rode in processions, reviewed treaties, smiled for portraits. To the outside world he remained formidable. But to those who served him, who dressed his wounds, lifted him from bed, and stood in awkward silence. During his longer spells of rage, there was no denying it. Something inside Henry VIII had changed. It's easy to see history's giants as fixed statues unmoved by time. But here in the muddy courtyard of Greenwich, we see something else entirely. We see a man brought low by the very performance meant to show his strength. We see armor as prison, horse as weight, power as illusion. And so begins not just the second half of Henry's reign, but the quiet unraveling of a man who once dazzled Europe with his brilliance. The fire still flickers in him, but the air has changed. You might think he recovered, and in some ways he did. The king walked again. He ruled. He signed proclamations with the same confident flourish, summoned advisers, hosted foreign dignitaries. There were still feasts and ceremonies. His voice, when raised in command, still carried the weight of an empire. But beneath the rituals, behind the golden embroidery, and the carefully managed portraits, something unspoken had taken root. It wasn't visible at first. A tone, a glance, a change in how long he stared into silence after someone spoke. Henry VIII had always been forceful. He was a king, after all, but there had been a kind of generosity in his earlier rule. He had loved ideas, loved to be loved. And now, that version of him seemed to have receded behind his own eyes. There's a story that after the jousting accident of 1536, Henry's behavior began to shift in unsettling ways. Not all at once, no storm arrives in a single gust. But soon the people who had known him best began to whisper. The king was no longer the man he once had been. He became quicker to anger, slower to forgive. Where he had once been charming and patient, he was now irritable and suspicious. Some modern historians point to what we now recognize as signs of a traumatic brain injury, a blow to the frontal lobe that, though silent, can turn a man's own mind into unfamiliar territory. There were no medical scans in Tudor England, no neurologists, only trembling hands taking notes in candlelight, and cautious glances exchanged behind velvet curtains. Those closest to him, his physicians, his secretaries, even his cooks, began adjusting their tone, choosing their words with even greater care. One wrong phrase could now mean exile, or worse. According to foreign ambassadors, the king had become prone to melancholy episodes. He would weep alone one day and lash out the next. The line between royal dignity and personal unraveling began to blur. But it wasn't just his temper. His relationships with those around him also grew more fragile. After Anne Boleyn's execution, his third wife, Jane Seymour, seemed to bring a moment of peace. She was calm, obedient, devout, everything Anne had not been. She bore him a son, Edward, and died days later. Henry grieved. Deeply, some say. He wore black for months. He commissioned elaborate tombs. But even then there was a hollowness to his mourning. The grief felt more like a ceremony than a process, more performance than healing. And then over the following years came more wives. Some feared, some discarded one executed. But none of them seemed to reach him. Not really. They were portraits on a wall, names in a succession, placeholders in a story that was slowly losing coherence. The king, once so full of words and wit, now often sat in long silences, his thoughts flickering behind unreadable eyes. Sometimes he would speak as though arguing with someone no one else could see. Sometimes he would stop mid-sentence, then stare out the window as if the past were whispering louder than the present. One of his courtiers noted in a letter that Henry had developed a peculiar habit of pacing late into the night dressed in heavy robes, speaking to the shadows as if seeking counsel. The man who had once led armies broken with Rome and outwitted popes now looked less like a ruler and more like someone trying to remember where he had left himself. And as his behavior changed, so too did the energy of the court. The once vibrant halls grew quieter. Laughter became strained. Musicians played more softly, as if worried that the wrong note might be interpreted as insult. Even Henry's beloved hunting parties became less frequent, then ceased altogether. There's a certain fragility to power when it becomes afraid of its own shadow. The shift wasn't just emotional. Physically, Henry was changing too. He had begun to gain weight rapidly. His movements slowed. His skin lost its glow. The injury to his leg had become a source of constant pain. Every step was effort. His physicians, who had once offered tonics and optimism, now mostly brought cushions and silence. And yet in portraits from this time, Henry still appears defiant, upright, eyes fixed, legs wide in that now famous power stance. But these images lied because they were told to. The king instructed his artists to show him as he wished to be remembered, not as he was. The painters obeyed, of course. You don't defy a king's vanity, not when his moods hang by threads, and his memory is sharper than his mercy. Behind closed doors, though, the truth was clear. Henry was no longer fully present. A part of him, perhaps the best part, had been left behind on that cold tilt-yard in Greenwich, or buried alongside Jane Seymour, or sealed within the council chambers, where once he had argued passionately, but now simply nodded while others spoke. There's an old expression, the candle burns from both ends. For Henry it was more like a flame that had grown inward, consuming from the inside what once made him shine. Still the machinery of monarchy rolled on. Treaties were signed, wars planned, daughters were married, coins were minted with his face. But in the center of it all stood a man who no longer looked quite like a king, and didn't entirely behave like one either. There's a quiet kind of tragedy in watching a brilliant mind begin to drift. You want to reach out to catch some of what's slipping through his fingers. But kings aren't supposed to fade. They're supposed to endure unshaken, unquestioned. And so the court held its tongue, smiled when prompted, and tiptoed through the echoing chambers of Henry's world. One ambassador wrote in 1538, "The king is now less a man and more a symbol. He still ruled, yes, but increasingly he seemed to rule from a distance not geographic, but personal, from somewhere behind a veil no one else could lift. And yet he was still feared. That never changed. If anything, his unpredictability made him more terrifying. A monarch with a clear mind is dangerous enough. One with a wounded one is unknowable. Historians still debate the exact moment when the transformation solidified, when Henry VIII truly became the man of his final years. Some point to the jousting accident. Others blame the pressures of succession, the pain of lost love, the growing guilt of decisions he could never undo. Perhaps it was all of it. Perhaps it was none of it. Some say he simply aged poorly, while others argue he unraveled slowly under the weight of his own legend. But one thing is certain, something in him was gone. What remained was an echo of brilliance, a flicker of majesty housed in a frame that now stiffened more with each passing month. The king who once danced in gold-threaded doublets, who debated Erasmus, and delighted in love poems, he still bore the crown. But the man himself he was harder to find. Still the court moved forward, because it had to. The country still needed a ruler. The documents still needed signatures. And the people, most of whom never saw him, except on coins and tapestries, still believed in the man behind the curtain. But for those who stood in the candlelit corridors, who heard the sighs behind closed doors, who adjusted the pillows under his legs and whispered reassurances, he no longer seemed to hear those people knew. The second reign of Henry VIII had begun, not the reign of action and conquest, but the long, slow reign of decline. And so they carried on. The trumpets still played, the flags still flew. But behind the pageantry, the sound that echoed loudest was quieter than anyone expected, the sound of one man, slipping inward. You begin to notice the silence. It creeps in slowly at first, just a missing laugh at court. A quiet evening with no lute player. A hallway you walk alone that used to buzz with gossip and velvet shoes. Then it thickens. Whole wings of the palace seem hushed now. Tapestries hang heavy against the walls, not just for warmth, but for quiet. The king is resting, they say, or thinking, or praying. But fewer people are summoned to his presence, and fewer still are brave enough to linger. The palace doesn't ring with merriment anymore. It listens, carefully. You've heard stories, of course, that he sleeps through the mornings, that it takes several men just to lift him from bed, that his leg pain has worsened, and his appetite, always mighty, has grown unpredictable. Some days he eats everything in sight. Other days he turns his head and waves the platters away, too nauseous or too angry to indulge. No one questions him. They've learned not to. These days people learn quickly or disappear quietly. You find yourself watching how servants move around him, slowly, deliberately, never too fast, never too loud, and always from the side, never directly behind. The once lively court has adopted the movements of a sick room, though no one dares call it that. Even the jesters speak more softly now. One of them made the mistake of playing a French melody during a feast, and was never seen again. Not because of the tune, perhaps, but because Henry was simply not in the mood to be reminded of France. Behind those heavy doors, the king spends most of his time now in private rooms, designed to keep light out and warmth in. Layers of drapes cover the windows. Braziers burn night and day. Attendants pad across thick rugs, lifting bowls and cloths with practiced hands. He no longer dresses himself. That task requires 4 men, strong ones. His doublets are altered weekly seams, let out just a touch more each time. His boots are gone entirely now. Only slippers, soft, wide, and silent. This was once a court of movement. Henry had been a man of horses and music, of masques and progressions. He'd taken pride in his physicality, once said to be the most athletic monarch in Europe. But now even the act of being seen has become labor. He avoids it whenever he can. Audiences are rare, and when they do happen, they are tightly controlled. The king is presented seated, framed just so. Everything, the lighting, the garments, the positioning of furniture is curated to give the impression of a ruler still in command. And in a way, he still is. The letters are signed, the orders carried out. His voice still echoes when he chooses to use it. But it's the gaps between that speak louder now. The long absences, the endless afternoons behind closed doors, the days when no one is summoned and the only sound is the shuffling of feet outside his chamber, waiting just in case. They say the architecture of a king's mind can be seen in his rooms. Henry's apartments have become mazes of solitude. Outer chambers are staffed, but rarely visited. Inner rooms are narrow and windowless. No sunlight reaches the bed where he spends most of his time. Candles are changed by rotation. The smell of beeswax and damp velvet hangs in the air. It is warm, almost too warm, and yet it feels cold. And so the courtiers fill their days with careful performances. They still wear bright clothes, still flatter each other with shallow bows and sharper glances, but the center has shifted. The throne is no longer the heart of the room, it's the door to the king's chambers. Always closed, always watched. You hear that the king has taken to speaking to paintings, that he studies them not as art, but as companions. In particular, the one of Jane Seymour, the third wife, the one he claims to have truly loved. Her portrait rests above the mantel, now always visible from where he sits. He speaks to her, they say, sometimes with affection, sometimes as though asking for her forgiveness. The leg wound, people whisper, has never really closed. It flares up often, forcing him to remain in bed for days at a time. Some say it keeps him awake at night. Others claim he doesn't sleep at all anymore. No one knows for sure. The physicians have stopped offering hopeful prognoses. They just nod, bring linen, and keep the corridors quiet. Still, the royal painter continues his work. New portraits are commissioned, and though the king is no longer able to pose as he once did, the images are completed all the same. They show him upright, defiant standing, wide-legged with one hand on his hip and the other on a table of state. His legs look strong, his face alert. The truth, of course, is far gentler and far sadder. But portraits are not made to reflect reality. They're made to protect it. One of the portraits, perhaps the most famous, contains a detail that will be discovered centuries later during a careful restoration. Beneath layers of oil paint and varnish, a different object lies beneath the king's hand. Not a scepter, not a sword, but something darker. A staff, perhaps. And atop it what some experts will say was originally painted as a human skull. If true, it would suggest a man not only aware of his own decline, but fixated on it. No one dares ask the painter about it. The final version shows nothing but dignity. But the ghost of the earlier image remains just beneath the surface, literally. Henry's relationship with imagery is complicated. He knows the power of appearances better than most. For a king who once ruled through performance masks, tournaments, opulent rituals, it must have been unbearable to lose the stage. And so he constructs a new one, a stage made of stillness, controlled lighting, and carefully rehearsed silences. He instructs that when foreign envoys visit, they are to be greeted in an outer room. He will appear, but only briefly, and only once his position is secure, seated, arranged, perfected. There will be no sudden movements, no extended walks, no long discussions. The illusion must be maintained. And yet, even among those who never see him directly, the rumors spread that the king is no longer seen walking, that his legs must be wrapped each day with clean cloths, that the smell in his rooms is masked with strong perfumes imported from the East, rose oil, ambergris, musk, the sort of scents once reserved for lovers or queens, now used to disguise a body in decline. Still, he is king, and so the people continue to bow. The orders continue to come. The wars are planned, the taxes collected. The palace hums with duty. But the man at the center of it all, he is slipping further inward. There's a loneliness that power cannot cure, and Henry VIII, once surrounded by poets and scholars, now finds himself increasingly alone, not because no one is there, but because no one can reach him. Not fully, not anymore. It is in these quiet rooms behind these thick curtains that England's most commanding monarch begins the longest chapter of his reign. Not one written in law or conquest, but in shadows. And still the candles burn. You've always known the king had 6 wives. Everyone does. It's one of the first things people learn about Henry VIII. 6 queens, 2 beheaded, 2 divorced, 1 who died in childbirth, and 1 who outlived him. It's easy to turn them into a rhyme, a grim rhythm of marital misfortune. But what's harder to hold in your mind is how deeply lonely a life like that must have been on both sides. Because here inside the softly lit rooms of the aging king, where the windows are always curtained and the hearths are always stoked, you begin to understand something else. This isn't just a man who changed wives often. It's a man who kept losing them. When Henry first married Catherine of Aragon, he was still young, hopeful and full of ambition. She was his brother's widow, yes, but she was also poised, intelligent, devout. Their marriage lasted over 20 years longer than all the others combined. And yet, for all its longevity, it ended in bitterness, annulment, and exile. Catherine left court with her title stripped, her daughter Mary declared illegitimate. Henry never saw her again. Then came Anne Boleyn, bright, dazzling, and fiercely clever. The marriage that began in obsession ended in blood, executed on charges most now believe were fabricated. She too bore him a daughter Elizabeth, but never the son he craved. Jane Seymour did. She gave him Edward, and in doing so she won something no other wife ever did, his permanent favor. But she died just days after childbirth, a quiet death without scandal. And perhaps because of that she was idealized, elevated, immortalized. Henry would be buried beside her decades later. Anne of Cleves came next, a political marriage brokered by portrait, undone by personal disappointment. He called her unattractive privately, cruelly, and had the marriage annulled. To her credit, Anne played the long game. She accepted the title the king's beloved sister and lived comfortably for years far from the volatility of queenship. Then came Catherine Howard Young, vibrant, dangerously naive. She was likely a teenager when Henry, now nearing 50, pursued her. The age gap was stark. So was the imbalance of power. She made mistakes. She had past lovers. And eventually she was accused of infidelity. Her execution came quickly. Finally, Catherine Parr, intelligent, steady, and pragmatic. She nursed him more than she loved him, perhaps. But she survived him, the only one who did. 6 women, 6 lives intertwined with one man's legacy. Each one entered the marriage with different expectations, some political, some romantic, some naive. None of them left unchanged, and none, it seems, could ever truly reach him. Now, as you walk through the quieter halls of the palace, you notice their absence more than their presence. The rooms feel larger, somehow more echoing. There are portraits, yes, dresses preserved behind glass, but no laughter, no feminine footsteps. The Queen's chambers are empty. Henry spends more time with his memories than with people. He speaks of Jane often even years after her passing. He has her portrait positioned in his view wherever he is. There's a tenderness in his voice when he mentions her rare these days. Some courtiers say he speaks to her at night softly, as if she might still hear him. It's not just loss that marks these marriages, it's longing. Henry always wanted something more. A son, yes, but also devotion, admiration, legacy. Each wife gave him part of what he sought. None gave him all. And maybe that's the cruelty of power. It teaches you to expect everything and blames others when you receive only a portion. But the court never says this out loud. They simply change the bedding, polish the frames, and remove the names of the fallen from the daily announcements. There's a kind of grief that accumulates in palaces, not the loud weeping kind, but the quiet one, the kind that settles into upholstery and echoes through empty corridors. It lingers in rooms that once hosted queens, now sealed shut. It hangs in the air between the pages of love letters, never sent portraits, never finished cradles, never used again. Even the musicians seem to know. Their melodies have softened. Fewer dances are scheduled. The harpist rarely plays the more joyous tunes anymore. And when he does, no one requests an encore. Of all his wives, it is Jane who haunts him most. Not because she was perfect, but because she left before things could fall apart. Her death left nothing to unravel. No scandal, no betrayal. Just a clean sorrow. A sorrow he could polish and protect. A sorrow he could hold on to. He had her embalmed with care. Her funeral was grand. And though the years wore on and more wives followed, she remained the still point in a shifting sea. She became a myth within his own story, one he returned to often, especially when the days grew long, and the pain in his legs refused to let him sleep. Sometimes, as you walk past the royal chapel late at night, you think you hear him there, not praying exactly, just remembering. The history books condense it all into a few lines: 6 wives, a desperate quest for a male heir, a series of political maneuvers, and personal tragedies. But here in the soft shadows of Whitehall, the truth feels heavier, more human, less like a timeline and more like a set of rooms left cold. Because this was never just about marriage. It was about connection. And Henry, so powerful, so exalted, found himself locked out of it again and again. Whether by his own doing or by the quiet cruelty of fate, he was left with absence more often than presence. Even the throne seems to understand. It waits, empty more often now, draped in cloth, polished by silent hands, as if it too mourns something that never quite was. And so he sits, day after day, surrounded by the echoes of 6 women who once stood beside him and now live only in paintings and in whispers. You wonder sometimes, standing near the firelight, what he dreams about. If he sees them, if he says their names, if in some flickering edge of sleep he apologizes. No one will ever know. And maybe that's the final loneliness of kings. Not the absence of love, but the certainty that even when surrounded by queens, you might still go unheard. By now, the palace is no longer a place of grandeur, not really. It's a set of well-worn paths, the same corridors again and again, the same staircases where the velvet is thinning beneath your feet. And as you watch the king being lifted each morning by a web of servants' ropes and cushions, it becomes clear that the weight Henry carries is not just the sum of his royal regalia. It is something far heavier. He groans softly, not from theatricality, but necessity. Each movement is an effort. His once athletic frame has grown swollen, riddled with pain. It's not just age, though age plays its part. It's the lingering effects of that old jousting injury, perhaps. Or the ulcerated leg that no longer heals a wound that reopens as easily as memory. And there is the gout, too, that fires his joints like red-hot coals. His steps are limited to only a few now, and even then not without help. This is not a man who rides out with his banners flying anymore. This is a man who cannot mount a horse, and so ropes are fitted beneath his arms. He is hoisted gently into chairs, onto beds, into specially constructed mobility devices that resemble padded thrones with wheels. The floor is lined with thick rugs to soften any stumble, and always there are eyes watching, discreet, respectful, but always present. The king does not walk alone. Once courtiers competed for the honor of riding with him into the hunt. Now they compete to be the one who carries the basin to wash his hands. The rituals of kingship have shifted from glory to care, from trumpet fanfare to soft voices offering assistance. It is said by those close enough to know, though never publicly, that Henry can no longer ascend stairs. Special ramps have been installed. A mechanical chair designed to glide along the incline is whispered about. He is quite literally being lifted by the mechanisms of his own court. A king still crowned but now cradled. And here lies the quiet irony. He who ruled through physical power, who once dazzled with his athleticism, who inspired awe by his very stature, he is now diminished, not just in movement, but in command. His orders must now travel through layers of aides, his moods softened by intermediaries before they reach the court. Even his meals, once lavish affairs, are now curated for digestion rather than decadence. Bland broths, soaked bread, the occasional indulgence followed by pain. The throne remains near, but even sitting on it is a managed event. 2 guards flank him at all times, not for protection from others, but to ensure he doesn't fall from it. A rope discreetly runs beneath the velvet to help steady his weight. He no longer dances. He no longer kneels for prayer. The floor once beneath him has become a threat. But perhaps the most heartbreaking transformation is the way the sunlight hits him differently now. In earlier years, he used to stand by the windows, his silhouette bold, his gaze cast outward over gardens or troops or crowds. Now he avoids the light. His skin is often inflamed. His body temperature rises erratically. Thick drapes stay drawn. Even the architecture has adjusted to him. Palaces were once designed around the king's movement. Where he walked, others followed. Now they are designed around his stillness. And still he wears the crown. Not always, not physically. But the symbol of it hovers in every room he enters. In the silence when he groans. In the stillness when he nods for the day to begin. In the gentle way his servants help him into robes. Robes now cut looser, stitched with hidden lacing to accommodate swelling. There's something unspeakably human in the way the attendants work. Not pitying, not mocking. Just precise. Practiced. It takes 4 people to dress him now. 6 if he's to sit at council. A pulley system discreetly mounted into the canopy of his bed allows him to shift without displacing the wound on his leg. At night, scented cloths are placed near the bed, not for comfort, but to mask the smell. Because the king, for all his titles and treasures, is now decaying, slowly, publicly, and everyone knows it. There's no shame in it, at least not among the honest. He is still respected, still addressed with reverence, but the awe has shifted to something else, something more like care. Like containment. You overhear a page whisper to another once just briefly about how the king's weight has increased so dramatically that custom-made chairs now buckle after weeks of use. A smith is on constant rotation to reinforce the furniture. Gold leaf and ironwork combine not for beauty but support, and yet he remains dignified when he can. He still insists on certain ceremonies, the holding of court, the issuing of edicts. But even those edicts are becoming stranger. He once dictated a letter reprimanding a nobleman who had died 10 years earlier. Another time he demanded the immediate execution of someone who had never been charged. The council covers for him, of course, quietly shelving the orders, pretending delays in correspondence. But the signs are clear. The mind, like the body, is slipping. And still the empire moves around him. Diplomats arrive. Treaties are signed. Battles are fought, but the man at the center is slowly becoming a relic, a living one. There is one thing he still requests without fail: his armor. Not to wear, of course. That hasn't been possible in years. But he wants to see it, to touch it. Sometimes in the quiet of evening, he has it brought into his chambers and set upright on a stand. He gazes at it, silent, maybe remembering the man who once wore it. A historical tidbit quietly told among those who serve him says that Henry once had an enormous suit of parade armor made with an exaggerated codpiece, not for battle but display. It was meant to send a message, a symbol of power, virility, and dominance. Now it sits unused in the armory, oversized, comical, and yet eerily poignant, because that's what this stage of his reign has become, a memory of strength, preserved in brass and gold. A king who once embodied glory now glimpses it only in objects. Historians still debate how much of this physical decline impacted his leadership. Some argue that his decisions in these final years were clouded by pain and medication. Others suggest his will remained intact, if increasingly erratic. The truth is probably somewhere in between. But what's certain is that the court began adjusting for a future without him, long before his final breath. You feel it in the air now. Every cough from the king is followed by a flicker of worry in his physician's eye. Every missed council meeting brings speculation. Ministers whisper in doorways. Contingency plans are quietly drafted. And all the while, the king continues surrounded by layers of silk and protocol lifted by cords, and men seated on cushions that smell faintly of rosewater, and something darker beneath. He is not helpless, but he is no longer sovereign in the way he once was. And somehow that is harder to watch, because there is something sacred about strength, especially when it begins to fade. And here in the dim corridors of Whitehall, you are watching it dissolve, not in drama, but in slow, deliberate silence. He is still the king, but now more than ever he is also a man. The doors no longer close fully around him, not because of their size or fit, but because too many ears press against them. What was once a confident circle of trusted men has become a web of listeners, whisperers, and watchers. Something has shifted inside the royal mind, and everyone at court can feel it. You notice it first in the way people pause before they speak. Phrases are chosen more cautiously now. Compliments are delivered in soft tones, carefully neutral, as though weighed for approval. And the king's response often distant, sometimes delayed, and occasionally chillingly sharp. It begins with the orders. One afternoon, an edict arrives calling for the arrest of a man whose name hasn't been spoken at court for nearly 2 decades. Confused but obedient, the secretaries search old records, only to discover the accused has long since passed away. They hesitate to bring this up. Instead, they quietly remove the decree from circulation, and the name is never mentioned again. But it doesn't stop there. Soon, proclamations become jumbled. One decree demands the re-seizing of lands already held by the crown. Another orders the reappointment of a nobleman who has been blind for years and living in retirement. And sometimes, in moments of frustration or pain, Henry lashes out his voice, no longer booming with authority, but trembling with something closer to desperation. The council begins to adapt. Drafts of new orders are carefully pre-reviewed before being shown to the king. They rewrite as he dictates smoothing language, softening tone. What's spoken and what's written begin to diverge, and yet no one dares call it what it is. Even his old allies, men who have ridden beside him in war, who have toasted his victories and mourned his losses, begin to disappear. Some step back out of self-preservation. Others are dismissed in bursts of anger. Still others simply drift their loyalty, shaken by the ruler who now forgets names mid-sentence. And yet Henry remains dangerous. Not physically, perhaps, but politically. His signature still carries weight. His moods still dictate lives. And his paranoia, once occasional and restrained, now surfaces without warning. A courtier is summoned one morning only to be accused wildly publicly of treason. No evidence, no trial. Just a string of slurred accusations before the man is hauled away. Days later, the king forgets the incident entirely. But the court doesn't. Whispers ripple through the palace. Men begin to fear not just punishment, but being noticed. To be invisible is safer, quieter, less likely to spark the monarch's unpredictable ire. One particularly haunting moment lingers in memory during a private audience. Henry looks straight into the eyes of his Lord Chancellor and calmly declares that he is being watched by ghosts. He gestures to an empty corner of the room and names 3 former enemies long dead, all of whom he says conspire in silence. It is not a jest. The Chancellor nods solemnly. No one contradicts the king. Historians still debate whether this was true madness or simply the exhausted mind of a man in constant pain, filled with regret. Some argue that Henry remained lucid to the end, his eccentricities exaggerated by frightened courtiers. Others suggest that his mental decline was worsened by the constant doses of opiates and alcohol prescribed for his ulcers and joints. What cannot be denied is the tension it sowed. Meetings become shorter. Documents are now accompanied by cautious annotations. Even the jesters once free to poke fun have grown silent. It's no longer safe to laugh unless the king does first. And even then one must be careful not to laugh too hard. Some say that Henry began to revise history in his mind, that he would speak of events as though they had gone differently. He once declared that Anne Boleyn had been a loyal wife, only to pause confused when reminded she'd been executed on his orders. Another time, he claimed to have personally won a battle he hadn't attended. None of this is challenged aloud. The role of the court has shifted, from serving a leader to maintaining an illusion. It becomes their job to keep the machinery of monarchy running, even as the mind behind the crown flickers like a candle in wind. One of the more peculiar truths, perhaps even a morbid tidbit, comes from a royal clerk's diary. He writes that the king's physical stench, caused by his ulcerated leg, became so pervasive in later months that ministers took turns finding excuses to meet at a distance. Perfumed cloths were worn at the mouth. Meetings were shortened to mere formalities. A palace designed for ceremony was now orbiting the gravity of decline, and still the symbols of majesty persist. The crown is displayed during audiences. The banners are raised on feast days. Church bells ring in time with orders issued in a shaky voice. It's theater, yes, but theater with teeth, because at any moment the king might stir and remember his power. And so those around him continue the dance. You see a secretary smile too broadly when praised for a letter he didn't write. A nobleman bows 4 times in a single hallway. A woman curtsies so deeply she stumbles. These are not gestures of love. They are symptoms of fear, because no one can predict the king now. He may weep during prayers, or laugh at a hanging. He might sign a generous grant with one hand and revoke it with the other before sunset. He may speak of his son Edward with warmth, then an hour later declare the boy unfit to rule without counsel. And beneath it all, a quiet dread spreads across Whitehall. It is not the dread of death. That would be manageable, familiar, even noble. No, this is the dread of chaos, of watching something once mighty disintegrate, not in flame, but in fog. Slowly, unevenly, without clarity. Every servant, every minister, every courtier begins to ask the same question silently. Who will speak for the king when the king no longer speaks sense? For now the answer is no one. Not officially, but you notice the Lord Chancellor spending more time in the Privy Council. You see the physicians no longer delivering full reports to the king. You see a younger prince's tutors stepping into greater prominence. Succession is being prepared behind the tapestry of tradition, and yet the illusion is carefully maintained, because to admit what's happening, to say it aloud, would shatter more than protocol. It would break the spell of monarchy itself. And so everyone continues gently, delicately pretending that the king still reigns in full. They polish the throne. They straighten the scepter. They rehearse the ceremonies. And the man at the center, he still gives orders, though fewer now. He still holds court, though, with longer silences. And he still wears the face of Henry VIII, painted on banners, stamped on coins, etched into stained glass. But behind that face, the mind grows quieter. You feel it in the way ministers glance at one another before speaking, in the way the fire is never allowed to die in his chamber, not for warmth, but to mask the smell, in the way the court moves as though walking on frost, fearing a single wrong step might crack the ice beneath. This is not just the decline of a man, it is the trembling hush before the crown falls. The painting hangs high in the gallery where candlelight shimmers across its varnished surface. To the casual eye, it's a triumph Henry VIII at his most formidable. Legs wide in the classic power stance, shoulders squared beneath gold-trimmed velvet, one hand on his hip, the other resting heavily on a table draped in royal red. And his face so still, so certain, a face that dares you to doubt him. But you know better now. You've walked the hallways behind that portrait. You've seen the physicians tiptoe past his chamber, the courtiers flinch at his laughter, the royal clerks quietly rewrite his confused orders. And you've heard whispered between walls that the portrait once held something else in his grasp, something disturbing, a detail painted over, erased, replaced with a simple glove or scroll, something more dignified. The rumor persists that the original painting showed the king clutching a cane, or worse, a crude representation of the mechanical device used to prop him upright in his final years. A detail far too real for posterity, too frail, too human, and so, like so much of his legacy, it was altered to match the myth. The truth, though, bleeds through the canvas, because by the time this portrait was completed, Henry could hardly stand unaided. His leg ulcer had grown worse, seeping through bandages and staining his linens. His gait was a lumbering shuffle punctuated by winces. His weight had ballooned to over 300 pounds, an enormous burden, for a body no longer built to carry it. Lifts and pulleys were used to hoist him onto his horse. At court he was often seen seated cloaked in rich fabric, not just for splendor, but to hide his swelling and sores. Yet still the image projects power. It had to. In a realm built on appearances, the illusion of strength mattered more than the reality. Subjects might never see the king in person, but they would see this portrait copied, engraved, displayed across the kingdom. It became the image of England's father, firm, fierce, undeniable. But inside the palace, things were less certain. He spent most days in semi-darkness, curtains drawn. Candles and braziers flickered day and night, thickening the air with wax and coal. Food was brought to him on platters too large for one man, yet he ate little. Pain dulled his appetite, and his physicians dosed him with cordials and tinctures, hoping to keep his humors in balance, though most were only dulling his mind. One strange habit emerges in letters, from the time he began ordering his attendants to bring him mirrors, then flinging them away after a single glance. Some accounts say he would stare silently, as if unable to recognize the man staring back. Others suggest he mumbled about shadows on his face, shadows no one else could see. Historians still argue whether this was merely the delusion of an ailing king, or a metaphor spoken aloud by someone drowning in his own legacy. After all, the shadows were not just physical. They were memories, regrets, ghosts of queens and friends and enemies alike. And yet still he ruled. Just as the portrait refused to show his decline, the court refused to name it. Official records from this period are strangely vague. Letters stop mentioning his condition directly. Council meetings are held without him, but his name still appears in the decisions. The fiction is maintained with extraordinary care. It's as though everyone had agreed the king must always look like the king, even when the king is fading. And then comes the matter of succession. Edward, the long-awaited son born of Jane Seymour, was now 9. Pale, scholarly, obedient, too young to rule, but the only legitimate male heir. The pressure to ensure a smooth transition hung heavy over the palace. And Henry knew it. He began drafting and redrafting his will, naming a council of regents to govern in Edward's minority. But each time the names shifted. Allies fell in and out of favor within days. Promises were made and broken. At one point he declared that none but God could choose his successor's guardians. Then, days later, he appointed 16 men to the task. It was during these weeks that the king reportedly began sleeping with a dagger beneath his pillow. Not out of fear for his life, but out of fear for his power. He knew it was slipping away, and he wasn't ready to let it go. You hear strange tales from this time. One servant swears the king began talking to his dead wives, not aloud exactly, but in muttered fragments. It was her name, he said, the man claims. Not the first wife, not the last. The one in the middle. The one with the eyes. Anne Boleyn. Whether real or imagined, this vision lingered. He had sent her to the scaffold, and yet as his own end approached, her name still curled on his lips. The final touches on his legacy were hurried. He commissioned a new tomb, lavish, massive, but it was never completed. His remains would eventually be placed beside Jane Seymour's, the only wife who had given him a son, and not lived long enough to disappoint him. The symbolism was neat, the reality more complicated, because even in death, Henry would not rest alone. An odd and slightly macabre historical tidbit: when Henry was finally interred decades after his funeral, his coffin was laid above that of Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, his oldest friend. The two men had once jousted together in youth. Now they rested in the same vault. Whether planned or coincidence, no one knows. But the tomb's original design, a massive black marble sarcophagus with golden effigies, was never finished. Funds dried up, priorities changed, and the king, who had built an empire of ego, was buried in something far simpler. And the portrait, it outlived them all. Reproduced, revered, even studied centuries later as a masterclass in political image-making. Today, historians know that the version hanging in Hampton Court is not the first. It's one of many copies, each slightly different. Some omit the fur, others darken the eyes. But all share the same message: here is strength, here is command, here is Henry. Even if by the time the paint dried, the man himself could barely sit upright. What does that tell us? That power is a performance. That even a king, especially a king, is expected to wear a mask until the very end. And so the royal image endures, fixed in oil and myth. But you standing in the quiet gallery beneath its glare know something deeper. You've seen what lies behind the brushstrokes, and now the candle burns lower. Only a few more nights remain. You arrive now at the threshold of Whitehall Palace. The once great halls are quieter than before the rush of courtiers, replaced by the soft shuffle of slippers and the distant clink of metal trays. Outside, the River Thames slides past in slow procession, a mirror to the thick stillness that has taken root inside. And above, in one window that overlooks the gardens, there is always a single candle burning. It's there not for ceremony nor superstition, but for Henry. Or so the staff say, a gentle sign to the world that the king still breathes, still reigns, even if he cannot rise from his bed to see it. You step softly through the corridors now, and something has changed. The energy is hushed heavy. Even the guards speak in low voices. The scent of lavender oil has replaced wine, and bundles of herbs are tucked in wall crevices, not for decoration, but to mask other smells. The king is dying, and everyone knows it, though no one says the words. By this point, it is January 1547. Henry VIII is 55 years old. His once grand frame is consumed by infection, and gout by ulcers, that never healed by the sheer weight of decades. He remains cloistered in his privy chamber, attended by only his most trusted men, too swollen and frail to stand. They say he refuses confession, that he won't acknowledge what's coming. Or perhaps in his own way he's already begun to. The royal physicians, men of learning and grave faces, do little more than mix cordials and wipe his brow. They record his pulse, observe his temperature, pretend these rituals still matter. But medicine in Tudor England was more theater than cure. Bleeding had failed. Poultices had failed. No more leeches. No more purging. What remained was only the slow, inevitable hush of nature reclaiming a king. The king's attendants take shifts now, watching, listening, waiting. Servants move quietly around him, whispering updates from the council, even though he no longer responds. Once or twice they claim he stirred, opened his eyes as if searching the faces around him for someone not there. He never speaks again. An official vigil is formed, though the court continues its duties around it. Parliament is notified but told nothing conclusive. It would not be proper to say the king is dying until the moment has passed, until the words can be spoken in certainty and ceremony. There is a curious tradition in these final days. The king's confessor, brought quietly into the room, asks if he desires to be anointed. He cannot speak. He cannot nod. The confessor asks again, then interprets a movement, a breath, a flicker as consent. And so the ritual begins. Oil touches his chest. Prayers are whispered. Latin rolls through the room like incense. The last rites are performed not because the king requested them, but because his nation requires it. And then, in the small hours of January 28th, the king breathes one last time. There is no fanfare, no trumpets, no cries. Only silence. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, England has no king on the throne. But you wouldn't know it from outside. The court keeps the death a secret for days. The candle in the window still burns. Letters continue to leave the palace under Henry's name. Decisions are issued by the Privy Council in consultation with His Majesty. The appearance of continuity is essential until young Edward can be declared king in full ceremony. It's during this brief limbo that a remarkable tidbit emerges. The first person officially informed of Henry's death is not a royal nor a nobleman, but Sir Anthony Denny, his closest attendant and confidant. It is he who locks the privy chamber, who begins arranging the succession. For a brief, secretive span, Denny is the most powerful man in England, carrying the final whisper of the Tudor patriarch, like a candle between rooms. The funeral, when it comes, is grand but rushed. The body is placed in a coffin lined with lead sealed shut, due to the decay already setting in. It is transported slowly to Windsor Castle, accompanied by black-draped riders and banners fluttering in the winter wind, and here a detail both human and haunting. On the night the coffin rests at Sion Abbey, the lead gives way. A leak forms. The corpse of Henry VIII, bloated and volatile, bursts through its encasement, soaking into the wood beneath. The monks scramble to hide it. One chronicler, in a blend of poetry and horror, writes that dogs licked at the blood. The phrase is later drawn from the Bible, and dogs shall lick his blood. True or not, the story endures. And it says something, doesn't it? That even in death, Henry's legend grew grotesque. His power leaked beyond the page. But in the quiet that follows, England changes. Edward VI, just 9 years old, ascends the throne. A boy king with cold hands and frightened eyes, the realm is now in the grip of men who govern through his name. Reform continues. Executions stall. The long shadow of Henry's rule begins to thin, but it never disappears. Because here's the thing, Henry VIII never truly leaves. His laws remain. His church endures. His portraits still loom in every hall of power. And his children, Mary and Elizabeth, will one day reshape England all over again, each in reaction to the father they both revered and feared. Historians still debate whether Henry's death marked an end or a beginning. Was England freed by his passing or unmoored? Did the Tudor dynasty weaken, or was it strengthened by the legacy he left behind? You'll find no consensus, only ink and questions. But you standing now at the foot of his empty bed see something else. You see a man once loved, then feared, then mythologized, reduced in the end to breathbone and quiet. And a candle in the window, flickering on for no one. So we leave Henry here beneath stone and silence. But don't drift off just yet, because kings do not fall alone. In palaces across the world, in courts, gilded and distant, other monarchs met their own final nights with grief, with loneliness, with grandeur. Their candles, too, have stories to tell. Let's wander across those chambers together, shall we? You arrive now at the golden gates of Versailles, far from the grey skies of England and the heavy footsteps of Tudor power. The halls here are gilded with more than just gold, they're coated in performance. Mirrors stretch endlessly along the gallery walls, reflecting candlelight, and powdered wigs designed to remind everyone of who stood at the center of it all, Louis XIV, the Sun King. But tonight the mirrors are quiet, and the sun is beginning to set. You wouldn't know it from the outside. Versailles still hums with routine courtiers. Still bow servants still shuffle the fountains, still sing their watery symphony across the gardens. But if you listen closely past the rustle of silk and ritual, there's a softness in the air, something changing. It's the early 1710s. Louis has reigned for more than 70 years. No monarch in European history had held the crown so long, and few had worked so obsessively to keep it. He is a man who once led armies, built a palace to centralize power, and rewrote etiquette to suit his image. But time, as always, rewrites things back. Now in his 70s, Louis walks slowly, if at all. His legs ache, his jaw swells, and every day begins with pain. His physician notes his growing frailty, though no one dares suggest that the man who became king at age 5 is finally running out of reign. Inside his bedchamber, more ceremonial stage than restful retreat, Louis lies beneath heavy drapes surrounded by portraits of his ancestors and the crucifix he clings to with increasing devotion. Visitors are carefully selected. Even family is filtered. For this Sun King, privacy is both privilege and strategy. And yet what lingers most in these final years isn't pain. It's loss. One by one, Louis's heirs begin to vanish. In 1711, his only legitimate son, the Grand Dauphin, dies of smallpox. The following year, his grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, also succumbs to illness, along with the young Duchess and their elder son. Suddenly, the long line of succession collapses, leaving only one fragile life, a sickly great-grandson, the future Louis XV, still a toddler. This is not the twilight Louis envisioned, not the carefully choreographed inheritance of absolute monarchy, not the unbroken blaze of a solar dynasty. It's a flickering candle on a stormy night. He grieves, but as always, he does so behind his velvet mask. You sit beside him now, watching as he continues his routines. He still receives reports, still discusses matters of state, still attends Mass. But behind the elaborate brocade and stiff wig, his eyes drift often toward the window. There's something else, something both tragic and oddly telling. In these final years, Louis commissions a new portrait of himself. Not as a tired old king, but as an eternal monarch wearing Roman armor, standing tall sword in hand with no hint of age. The image is timeless. The body beneath it is not. Historians still argue whether this was vanity or strategy. Was Louis clinging to his image for comfort, or carefully crafting the legacy he wanted to leave behind? Was it self-delusion or brilliant propaganda? A curious tidbit floats through the records. Near the end, when his physicians finally acknowledge what Louis already suspects, a gangrenous leg that will not heal, he reportedly accepts the news with calm. Then he turns to his great-grandson and whispers advice for ruling. Well, avoid war, ease the people's burdens, and don't overbuild palaces. Even the sun, it seems, can set with wisdom. In September 1715, Louis XIV dies at the age of 76. His reign had spanned generations, shaped France into a centralized power, and left behind a legacy as dazzling as it was difficult. The bells of Paris toll solemnly, but not all weep. For many commoners, his passing is a moment of mixed emotion. Taxes were high. Wars were endless. Versailles had shimmered while the countryside starved. But still, in history's great gallery, Louis remains painted, praised, and pondered. You take one last look at the ornate room, the drapes now drawn the echoes of courtiers fading. And then you turn away not just from a monarch, but from an era. Because as with Henry VIII, the death of Louis XIV wasn't just an end. It was a lesson wrapped in lace. And lost, no matter how vast your power, it cannot outpace time. Not even when you name yourself the sun. Now let's travel from these perfumed chambers of French grandeur to a different kind of farewell. One that's part jest, part enigma, and entirely English. Because while some monarchs fade with silence, others meet the end with a smile. And that's where Charles II awaits us. You awaken in a chamber that smells faintly of oranges ink, and something you can't quite name mirth, maybe. A low fire flickers beside you, casting shadows across embroidered pillows and high velvet chairs. And somewhere down the corridor music plays. It is not mournful. It is not solemn. It skips and sways as if the night itself has been invited to a masquerade. You are no longer in Versailles, or the echoing palace halls of Whitehall past. No, this is a room built for a different kind of monarchy. A lighter one. A merrier one. And at the center of it all, a man who, even in his last breath, never quite let the laughter leave. Charles II of England. A king remembered less for tyranny and more for banter, less for conquests and more for comebacks. The Restoration King, the man who returned to the throne after England, had flirted ever so briefly with being a republic. You might think the final days of such a king would be quiet, grave, ceremonial, but instead they were a series of whispered jokes, warm glances, and moments that seemed just this side of mischievous. When you arrive, he's already tired, his gait heavier than it once was, his eyes surrounded by a depth that only pain or memory can carve. But his wit, that's still sharp as a blade. You hear it in the way he greets his physician, in the way he nods to the courtiers gathered near, and above all in the way he tries to make even death a little less terrifying for everyone else in the room. "Don't let me forget to thank the doctors," he murmurs, a crooked smile curling at the corner of his lips. It's not a speech, not a pronouncement, just a whisper meant to dissolve tension. By the time his final illness set in, it was February 1685, and it was sudden. A convulsive fit followed by seizures left the court scrambling. For 9 days the king lingered in what could only be described as a state of spirited dying. He received the last rites of the Roman Catholic Church, quietly, of course, so as not to stir political uproar. He forgave enemies, gave away his worldly goods, and asked his illegitimate children to behave with dignity. One of the most curious facts, he never named a legitimate heir. Because there wasn't one. Charles had many mistresses, some remembered in portraits, others in pamphlets, and many children, but not one born of a royal wife. His queen, Catherine of Braganza, bore no children, and while he remained publicly loyal to her, the silence between them in those final days must have been something heavy. Not cruel, perhaps, just quiet, as though both had accepted a lifetime of companionship that never quite transformed into intimacy. You notice something strange about his bedchamber. Yes, there are documents, medals, paintings, yet there's also a small gilded cage. A monkey. Real or imagined, you're not sure. But the king, as it turns out, was fond of animals. Monkeys, dogs, parrots, many of them roamed the palace freely to the horror of more fastidious courtiers. In fact, there's a rather delightful tidbit recorded in jest, though possibly true, that Charles once named his pets after members of Parliament. You can picture it. Clarendon stopped chewing the table leg. Danby fetched the presence of such creatures wasn't merely frivolous. In a court often weighed down by Protestant-Catholic tension, economic debates, and the looming threat of civil war, these animals served a strange function. They were little interruptions of joy. Charles, known affectionately as the Merry Monarch, created a world where pleasure coexisted with politics. And in that world, the animals, the theater, the banquets, they were not distractions. They were part of governance, part of how he ruled, not just how he escaped. And yet, as the days passed, the fire behind his eyes dimmed. The court grew still. The jokes slowed. A silence crept in, not because Charles had nothing left to say, but because everyone else feared the weight of what came next. Who would succeed him? What would become of the carefully restored monarchy? Would his Catholic brother James be accepted or rejected? Historians still argue whether Charles's Catholic conversion at the end was genuine or merely political. Was he always Catholic in private, navigating a Protestant court with a strategist's precision? Or did he convert only when the finish line appeared in sight? Scholars continue to debate the sincerity of his final rites. But you standing here beside him aren't thinking about theology. You're thinking about the way he grips his favorite cane, the way he turns his head slowly toward the sound of laughter in the corridor, and smiles as though the world still has one more jest to offer. There's a warmth to these final moments that's difficult to describe. It's not joy. It's not sorrow. It's something in between, an emotional chiaroscuro that wraps itself around the fading king like a velvet cloak. He knows what's coming. He's not afraid. Or at least he wears his fear like a mask of wit. He coughs, once, then again. The courtiers inch closer, their powdered wigs bobbing slightly in anticipation. And then the king speaks one last time. "I'm sorry, gentlemen, for being such a long time dying," he says. "It must be terribly inconvenient for you." A ripple of nervous laughter follows. And just like that, the room exhales. It's hard to imagine a monarch dying with a smirk. But Charles managed it. Whether it was bravery, defiance, or habit, his humor endured, where strength could not. When the bells tolled that day, they were not heavy with despair. They were confused, perhaps even reluctant. A king who had walked a tightrope between chaos and order religion, and pleasure scandal, and statecraft was gone. But he had left behind a blueprint, not for how to rule with an iron fist, but how to endure with grace. The Restoration was never meant to last forever, but for a few decades it offered England a strange reprieve. And Charles II, its merry centerpiece, bowed out not with fanfare, but with a wink. You leave the chamber as shadows lengthen on the floor. The fire still crackles. The monkey still swings from its perch. Somewhere a jest hangs in the air unfinished, like a song half sung. And though the throne now waits for James II, the memory of Charles lingers longer than his crown ever did. Behind you the door closes. Ahead the dusk of another monarch awaits. But for now the world holds still, caught in that peculiar stillness, where one era ends and the next has not yet dared begin. You hear the bells first, not the triumphant clang of a coronation, but the quieter chime of a foreign chapel, echoing in an unfamiliar city, where French is only one of many tongues spoken. This is Cologne on the banks of the Rhine, far from the grand halls of the Louvre, or the manicured gardens of the Palais de Luxembourg. The light is grayer here, the architecture heavier, and the air carries the scent of wood smoke, wax, and cold stone. It's not France, but it is where she ends. Marie de Medici, once Queen of France and Mother of Kings, is no longer cloaked in majesty. Here in a modest house tucked away in German exile, she is simply a woman displaced, forgotten by many, mourned by few, remembered, mostly for the weight she once carried, and the throne that in the end would not carry her back. You step inside the villa that now shelters her. It is tasteful. Yes, she would never allow anything less, but it is small. The ceilings are lower, the mirrors less grand. The tapestries are from an older time, and their stories like hers are slowly fading. The windows rattle faintly in the wind, and somewhere beyond them a church bell tolls the hour as it always has. Regular, indifferent. She is seated by a window, bundled in layers of Italian lace and thick velvet, the kind you suspect was never meant to be worn every day, but has long since become her armor. Her fingers are gnarled now, no longer the smooth white porcelain of her youth, but she still wears rings, dozens of them. Rubies, sapphires, the occasional emerald symbols of a royal past that will not be erased so easily. Her expression is not mournful. It is watchful. It is tired. It is regal, still in a quieter way. And oh, the perfumes. There are bottles everywhere, lined on the vanity tucked beneath the bed, clustered near the wash basin. Marie brought them with her when she fled Paris, more than 80 flacons of perfume, each carefully labeled and stored in its own satin pouch. Not merely for vanity, no. For memory, for identity. The scent of orange blossom reminds her of Florence, rosewater of her wedding, frankincense of her coronation, each one a ghost she has chosen to preserve in glass. But this life of bottled memories and borrowed space was not the one she imagined when she married King Henry IV of France. Back then, she was the Medici princess heir to the most powerful banking dynasty in Italy. Her dowry alone helped stabilize the French crown. And when Henry IV was assassinated in 1610, just a year after she was crowned, Marie became regent for their young son, the future Louis XV. She ruled with forced decisiveness and a taste for ceremony that made some French nobles uneasy. Italy still clung to her, the architecture she commissioned, the artists she patronized, the elaborate court rituals she imported. Some called her cultured, others controlling. She did not seem to mind. Power, after all, had a scent of its own. It lingered in velvet drapes and golden candle holders, and echoed through long marble corridors. But her regency was not to last. As Louis XV came of age, tensions brewed. Marie's favoritism towards certain advisors, especially the Italian Concino Concini, sparked widespread resentment among the French nobility. Her son, now king in title and ambition, ordered Concini's arrest and assassination in 1617, and Marie she was exiled to Blois. Her own son's signature was on the decree. Historians still argue whether Marie's downfall was the result of genuine misrule or carefully crafted political manipulation. Some say she clung too tightly to the role of Queen Mother. Others claim her presence threatened the ambitions of Cardinal Richelieu, who would go on to dominate Louis XIV's reign. The truth is likely a tangled mix of both. But one thing remains clear: the woman who had once ruled France was now unwelcome within its borders. She escaped exile only to face it again. Recalled briefly to court, she clashed once more with Richelieu and again was forced to flee. This time she did not return. Now in this quiet Cologne house she waits. For word from France, for reconciliation, for history to soften. But the years pass and the letters grow fewer. Louis writes only when protocol demands. The court whispers her name less often. The world she helped build has moved on without her. You glance around the room. A few paintings remain portraits of herself, her husband, her children. None of them recent. The paint is beginning to crack. The colors no longer shine like they once did. Even memory fades with time. She speaks sometimes to her servants of the gardens at Fontainebleau, of the feasts at the Louvre, of the grand ballets she once sponsored. But always in the past tense. She does not pretend she will see them again. She speaks of France the way one might speak of a dream, upon waking vivid, beloved, but unreachable. And yet she maintains her rituals. She rises at the same hour. She dresses with care. She writes letters each week, most of which go unanswered. She attends Mass without fail, even when her knees ache so fiercely that she must be carried part of the way. For Marie de Medici, routine has become resistance. She cannot reclaim a throne, but she can uphold the dignity of one. There is a particularly poignant moment, one you happen to witness. A maid brings her a new bottle of lavender water. Marie uncorks it, inhales, and closes her eyes. For a second, her face softens as though she has been transported elsewhere, to a balcony in Florence, perhaps, or a chapel in the hills. When she opens her eyes again, she nods. Just once. And the maid understands. It is tempting to imagine her as bitter. But that would be too easy. There is bitterness, of course. What woman cast aside by her own child would not feel it? But it is wrapped in so many layers of ritual pride and habit that it has become something else. Something quieter. Something colder. Marie dies in 1642 alone in this house in Cologne, surrounded not by the grand court she once commanded, but by a handful of attendants, and the heavy hush of foreign walls. Her funeral is modest. The French court sends condolences, but not a delegation. No grand procession. No state mourning. She is officially a former queen consort and nothing more. And yet you cannot help but feel that her story lingers, like the scent of those perfumes, faint but persistent, long after the bottles have emptied. Her children carried pieces of her legacy, even if they did not carry her memory. Her patronage shaped Baroque art in France. Her political missteps perhaps taught the young Louis XIV caution. Her failures, like her triumphs, left their mark. There is a saying in her native Florence, "What is not remembered never truly existed." Marie de Medici lived her final years, fighting that oblivion not with armies or edicts, but with ritual and rosewater, with velvet sleeves and stubborn dignity. As you step away from her story, the bells toll again, this time more distantly. The wind has picked up, rustling through trees along the Rhine. The windows rattle once more, but no one stirs inside. The queen has gone. And ahead of you, beyond the narrow cobbled streets of Cologne, beyond the Rhine's endless current, another figure waits. A man of war, of discipline, of silent resolve. His empire is not of silk and perfume, but of steel and ink. You feel the quiet pull of the east, the hush of temple bells and the rustle of rice paper. Tokugawa Ieyasu awaits. You might not feel the sea breeze, not in the gilded salons of Versailles or the shadowed halls of Whitehall, but it's there, blowing gently through the pines of Sunpu Castle. A world away from the courtly gossip of European monarchs, another man once ruled an empire not with flamboyance or flair, but with patient strategy and quiet resolve. And now, as the breeze stirs a bamboo screen ever so slightly, you find yourself in the presence of someone who had already won and quietly stepped away from the game. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate, had long since unified Japan. But this chapter of his life, it isn't about power plays or grand battles. It's about what happens when a man who shaped a nation chooses instead to sit, write, and breathe. You move slowly along the polished corridor past gardens, arranged not for splendor, but for stillness. The gravel is raked into deliberate curves. Koi ripple beneath a tiny bridge. And within the house, bare wood, delicate scrolls, tatami mats faded from sun, and time there is peace. Not the performative kind where servants hustle to make it seem like serenity reigns. This is the real kind, earned peace. Ieyasu didn't die in a blaze of political conflict, nor was he banished by rivals or betrayed by kin. He orchestrated a nation, and then in his final years, orchestrated silence. He had moved to Sunpu in 1605 after formally handing over the title of shogun to his son Hidetada. But make no mistake, he didn't exactly relinquish control. Ieyasu still advised behind the scenes, still kept an eye on Kyoto, still knew the pulse of daimyo rivalries and foreign merchants' ambitions. It was like setting down the sword but keeping it within reach. And as you enter the study, his study sparse but meticulous. You notice the inkstone has been recently used. There are scrolls, pages, words. Ieyasu in retreat had turned his attention to the one thing harder than conquest legacy. Historians still debate whether his retreat was genuine resignation or a calculated maneuver to ensure smooth succession. After all, stepping back while still breathing sent a powerful message. Loyalty to the Tokugawa clan was not conditional on death. It allowed him to test loyalty in real time. And it let his son Hidetada learn the weight of the shogunate, with a cushion underneath the presence of a living founder who could advise, correct, or scold depending on the day. Yet as you settle onto the wooden veranda toes, just brushing the edge of the sun-warmed platform, you can't help but feel the man's life slowing. His health, while steady, began to waver. He was well into his 70s, a rare feat for a samurai of his generation. He credited his longevity not to divine protection or good breeding, but to moderation and a curious fondness for a certain dish: tempura. Yes, the battered fried delicacy you might associate with modern Japanese cuisine was a favorite of Tokugawa Ieyasu. The story goes that he believed eating tempura in moderation helped maintain his health. And though historians will point out that this claim may be apocryphal, or at least indulgent, it's a lovely image, isn't it? The founder of a shogunate enjoying lightly battered shrimp in peaceful retreat, convinced it was the secret to his vitality. A quirky tidbit, sure, but one that paints a more human portrait than any stone statue could. Still, Ieyasu was no romantic. His writings in those final years were focused and purposeful. He helped commission the Buke Shohato, a set of laws regulating the conduct of the daimyo and warrior class, ensuring that even after his departure, Japan wouldn't spiral into the chaos of old. He corresponded with Buddhist monks, exchanged letters with scholars, and made meticulous records of family trees and lineages. Order, structure, precision. The same traits that let him defeat his enemies at Sekigahara were now applied to ink and scroll. There's a rumor, one whispered, never proven, that he ordered the construction of a secret tomb in Nikko before his death. Not just any tomb, but one that aligned with spiritual energy points in the Japanese landscape, following feng shui principles believed to protect the realm. Whether true or not, the story speaks volumes. This was a man thinking beyond his body, beyond even his dynasty. A man trying to mold memory. And perhaps he succeeded. The Tokugawa shogunate would endure for over 250 years, guiding Japan through one of its longest periods of peace. When Ieyasu died in 1616, it wasn't in the chaos of battle or the chill of exile. It was in his sleep, or so the record says, after suffering from an illness many believe was cancer of the stomach or esophagus. He was around 73 or 75 years old, depending on which calendar you follow. Even his death leaves room for scholarly discussion. They say his body was interred at Kunozan Toshogu, but then later moved to Nikko, where the famous mausoleum still stands, elaborate, gold-trimmed, perched in the forest, like something half-dreamt. The choice of Nikko was strategic, as much as spiritual, far from Kyoto, yet close enough to symbolize protection over Edo, modern-day Tokyo. His deification as Tosho Daigongen, Great Gongen Light of the East, was both a religious and political move, cementing him as more than man, as protector, as spirit, as founder. And yet you wonder, what did the man feel in those final weeks? Did he look out from his window and see the mist curling over the trees, wondering whether Japan would hold together without him? Did he fear the ambitions of lesser men? Or did he simply close his eyes, knowing he had done all he could? You watch the garden. A carp flicks its tail. A breeze shifts a hanging bell. Somewhere beyond the wall, a servant walks with soft steps, bringing rice, and yes, perhaps even a small plate of tempura. The world moves gently, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, a man who shaped the bones of a nation, finally lets it. His life reminds you that leadership isn't always about the throne. Sometimes the most powerful decisions are made not in the roar of battle, but in quiet rooms filled with ink and thought. The warrior who becomes the writer, the general who becomes the gardener. It's a softer ending than many rulers receive, but perhaps all the more powerful for it. And as the light fades over Sunpu Castle, and your breath slows in rhythm with the wind, you realize something simple but profound. Even the greatest architects of power must one day become still. The walls are red, not the blushing red of a fan dancer's cheek, or the faded rose of an old imperial robe, but the deep, lacquered red of power. You step lightly beneath a carved gate, flanked by golden lions that don't roar but watch. Ahead, the long corridors of the Forbidden City stretch like time itself, endless ceremonial, filled with footsteps you can't hear anymore. And waiting behind a silk curtain at the far end of it all is a woman, who ruled behind screens, yet whose reach was long enough to bend the course of an empire. Empress Dowager Cixi. Her name was whispered by diplomats and echoed across continents, even as she rarely appeared in public. She didn't need to. Her strength didn't live in display. It lived in orchestration. As you cross the smooth stone tiles of the courtyard, the hush here is almost sacred. And in that hush you begin to feel the weight of her presence, not in her footsteps, but in the way no one moved in court without her permission. Even the emperor, her nephew Guangxu, bowed more to her shadow than to his own authority. For nearly 5 decades, Cixi ruled Qing China in all but name, regent, advisor, orchestrator of succession, and as some historians still argue, the true sovereign of China's final imperial age. By the time her final days arrived in 1908, she had already seen the world change more rapidly than perhaps any ruler before her. Railroads had crisscrossed her empire. Telegraphs buzzed with whispers. Western powers had carved and pressured and humiliated the court with demands and unequal treaties. And yet she remained, surviving the Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion, diplomatic betrayal, and palace intrigue. Cixi outlasted generals and ministers alike, not with brute strength, but with a sharp mind and the patience of a spider. In her final months, the Empress Dowager was ill. Accounts differ. Some say heart failure. Others suggest arsenic poisoning, or the cumulative toll of age and chronic illness. She was nearing 73 years old. Her once celebrated silk gowns embroidered with symbols of phoenixes and longevity now hung more heavily on her frame. But the silk curtain never truly lifted. Decisions still passed through her chamber. Her eunuchs, long trained to read her tone, rather than her words, continued their silent ballet of obedience. And one of the final decisions she ever made just hours before her death was to name Puyi, a mere toddler, as the next emperor of China. It was an astonishing move, both practical and symbolic. With her nephew Guangxu already gravely ill, and as some allege possibly already dead, Cixi acted swiftly. She declared the child emperor while still clinging to her last threads of vitality, one hand choosing the future, the other letting go. Historians still argue whether Guangxu died before or after Cixi, and whether she had a hand in hastening his end. Some whisper of arsenic-laced orders. Others suggest natural causes. No one agrees. What is certain, though, is that Cixi's grip on court life did not wane even as her own life slipped away. In a palace built to withstand centuries, her body gave out at a time of great fragility for the empire itself. And here comes your tidbit, a softer stranger detail among the storm of politics and legacy. Each evening, even in her final years, Cixi insisted on opera. But not just any opera. She had an entire theater built within the Forbidden City, exquisite miniature, and entirely for her. She would sit alone in a specially designed throne box, draped in brocade, and watch performances, tailored only for her eyes. The actors bowed only to her. The music played only for her. The applause, of course, was silent. She didn't need it. For Cixi, the palace was her stage, and she was both audience and star. Imagine her in those evenings. Lanterns glowing amber incense curling into dragon-shaped plumes, the hum of strings and flutes echoing against lacquered walls. No one else dared speak. No one else even dared breathe too loudly. Because when Cixi watched opera, the empire itself paused with her. But not even she could pause time. On November 15th, 1908, the curtain fell. Her body was placed in a grand coffin, lined with yellow silk and embroidered with celestial symbols. Funeral arrangements were already prepared because, of course, they were. In life, she controlled everything. In death, she would control the memory. You glance upward, noticing a carved ceiling above the stage she once adored. It's shaped like a lotus petals unfolding layer by layer. Perhaps that's how she saw her life. Not as a single dramatic climax, but as a series of petals layers of strategy survival and quiet domination. Outside the Forbidden City, the world was cracking. Republican voices were rising. Revolution stirred in distant provinces. And yet inside these walls, she had orchestrated the slow final waltz of an empire that would not quite survive her. Within 3 years of her death, the Qing dynasty would collapse. Puyi, her chosen boy emperor, would be dethroned before he truly understood what a throne was. But you don't feel collapse here. You feel quiet, silk beneath your hand, a draft that rustles through red lacquered lattice, the weight of incense fading, and you realize endings are not always loud. Sometimes they happen behind a screen with a final whispered order, a last turn of the wrist and the dimming glow of a woman who ruled without ever needing to shout. Cixi reminds you that power doesn't always arrive in the form of armies or decrees. Sometimes it wears earrings, rides in gilded palanquins, and decides the fate of empires from behind silk. She may be gone, but her perfume lingers jasmine sandalwood and the faint trace of command. And so, as the golden roofs of the Forbidden City catch the last of the setting sun, you take one final breath in her world, where behind every curtain a decision waits. You feel the wind first salt-heavy, persistent, and without apology. It claws at your cloak as you step out onto the barren rocks, boots finding uneasy grip on the jagged earth. There is no palace here, no throne room, no cheering crowds or velvet halls, just the chill of the South Atlantic and the faint shadow of a man once known across Europe by a single name, Napoleon. This is St. Helena, a speck of volcanic stone between continents, inhospitable and forgotten by time except for this. This is where Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who once crowned himself Emperor of the French, ended his days in exile. And it's here, amid the mossy stone walls and wind-battered fences, that the echoes of his final years still drift like cannon smoke after the shot. You walk slowly up the worn path toward Longwood House, the modest residence that was more prison than palace. It's strange to imagine it held such a towering figure. Its peeling green shutters and damp, moldering rooms hardly seem fit for royalty. But then again, that was the point. The British didn't bring Napoleon here to honor him. They brought him here to forget him. After his defeat at Waterloo in 1815, there was no chance the European powers would risk another escape like his from Elba. St. Helena was different, remote, impossible to flee, a fortress of solitude disguised as a tropical exile. Here Napoleon was guarded by 1,000 ships in the harbor troops, in the hills spies even among the locals. A man once commanding millions reduced to pacing within earshot of the sea, where freedom whispered cruelly but never came closer. He spent his days in routine long walks in a small garden, dictating memoirs to loyal companions, clinging to the past with ink and fury. His health already in decline when he arrived, worsened under the island's damp air and loneliness. Rheumatism, stomach pain, and fatigue became constants. Food was bland, the weather oppressive. He grew bloated, pale, less like the iron-willed general of legend, and more like a man slipping quietly into myth. And yet he still held court. In his mind, in his writings, in the conversations with those few allowed near him, Napoleon never let go of his narrative. He debated history, revised strategy, argued politics, To his small circle of companions, he was still l'empereur, not the exiled prisoner of the British crown. And to history, that was for him to write. One of those companions, General Bertrand, described how Napoleon would reenact past battles using chess pieces and maps. Not for amusement, but for documentation, he was shaping his legacy. Every gesture, every correction to an aide's account was a stroke in the painting he hoped posterity would admire. Historians still argue whether this was delusion or defiance, but what's certain is that Napoleon didn't die quietly. By 1821, he was seriously ill. For months, he complained of abdominal pain, nausea, and weight loss. Autopsy later revealed a severe ulcer, or possibly gastric cancer, though some believe arsenic may have played a role. Hair samples from his remains have shown elevated levels, but the evidence remains inconclusive. He himself suspected poisoning. Paranoia or premonition, no one knows for sure. Now for your tidbit, wrapped in something gentler than court intrigue. Despite the bitterness, despite the fall, Napoleon held on to a quiet, almost tender habit. Each night before bed, he kissed a portrait of his young son, the King of Rome left behind in Europe, far from his father's reach. He kept the picture close, even on his deathbed. That tiny framed memory of his lineage, his hope, was one of the last things he saw. For all his grand plans and conquests, it was not a crown or a map he kissed, but the face of a child. In his final moments on May 5, 1821, Napoleon murmured, "France, the army, head of the army, Josephine," a fading thread of identity, love, and command. He was buried in St. Helena under a simple stone, though later his remains were returned to Paris. Today he lies in Les Invalides under a grand dome, as though to erase the years of exile. But here, on this wind-battered island, you still feel his ending more than his beginnings. You touch the cool stone of the house, see the garden where he walked, and smell the sea air that once taunted him daily. You sense a man grappling with the weight of being ordinary again. No titles, no battlefield, only time. And time was unkind. He had risen from obscurity to become the most powerful man in Europe. And yet in the end, he was left with nothing but memory's fading strength, and the company of loyal few who could no longer call him emperor in any meaningful sense. What do we make of this, a man who sought glory and reshaped Europe, ending in silence and salt air? Perhaps it's the inevitable gravity of ambition, or perhaps, as Napoleon believed, history would forgive the exile and remember only the fire. But here now you're standing on the stone where the fire burned low, where empire gave way to exile, and where a giant learned to whisper. The light is dim now as you turn from Longwood House. Mist rolls over the hills like a shroud. In the distance, a wind-worn fence creaks, echoing softly into the dusk. There is no imperial fanfare, no victory chorus, only the rustle of grass, and the memory of a man who refused to be forgotten. And as the sea roars just beyond the cliffs, you feel the pull of stillness again. Because even emperors, it seems, are not immune to the quiet. They just take a little longer to hear it. You stand at the edge of history now, no longer in a grand hall or a perfumed chamber, not waiting beside a throne, not whispering behind the veil of silk curtains. You've walked beside kings and queens, emperors and empresses, generals and regents. You've seen them rise with trumpets and tumble into silence. And now you've reached the end not just of one story, but of many. The velvet curtain is drawn. The candle gutter's low. This is where power fades into stillness. It's quiet here. Unusually quiet, considering how much noise power once made, how loudly it stamped through polished corridors, how fiercely it argued over succession, how greedily it gathered titles and jewels, laws, and lovers. But in the final hours, that noise rarely lingers. You start to realize it was never about volume. It was about presence. And now that presence is gone. You remember Henry VIII, don't you? How his once thunderous steps had to be assisted by servants. How a man who commanded nations couldn't lift himself from bed without ropes. His end wasn't marked by cheers or protests, but by the silent flicker of candles in windows, their wax dripping down like time itself. Too soft to protest, too slow to matter. It wasn't his wives, nor his wars, nor his towering portraits that stayed in the room. It was the smell of ointments, the shuffling of slippered feet, the sigh of heavy fabric as aides bowed for the last time. The man who had divided a church left behind not a reformation in that moment, but only the sound of stillness. And then there was Louis XIV, the Sun King. All his days were structured as tight and golden as the curls in his wig. His waking, his dressing, his eating, they were all performances. But no one performs death. The man who had once staged his life as theater faced his final act in the flickering gloom of Versailles, surrounded by courtiers, too frightened to speak, by rooms that had seen too many births and funerals to flinch. His dying days were marked not by opera, but by absences. He had outlived his son, his grandson, and even his great-grandson. The glittering court of mirrors reflected only a thinning figure and the quiet sorrow of survival. You traveled farther, too, to England again, but this time to the chambers of Charles II. He had joked his way through scandals, laughed beside poets, paraded his spaniels through palace halls. But in the end, even Charles had no more clever lines. Well, perhaps just one. "Let not poor Nellie starve," he said, half winking at a mistress's name as his breath thinned. There's something achingly human in that a monarch's last thoughts, not of statecraft or eternity, but of the people in his own little orbit. The party was long over, but the jest remained a faint ripple in the stillness. And Marie de Medici, so proud once, so commanding. Her name stamped on paintings and palaces, her fingers wrapped around the levers of French rule, while her son was still a boy. But mothers who rule rarely stay adored. In exile, her perfume outnumbered her guests. The woman who once governed France spent her final days not at court, but in Cologne. No fanfare, no throne, just the echo of steps, through unfamiliar stone corridors and the hum of distant bells. Even her name, once spoken with awe, softened to a whisper, then a memory. Some endings came with ceremony. Tokugawa Ieyasu, for instance, slipped away, not in disgrace or isolation, but in contemplation. In a quiet retreat with ink-stained fingers and scrolls unrolling into his lap, he traded battles for brushstrokes. There was no fall from grace, just a gentle step away from it. And in many ways, isn't that a rarer kind of courage to build a country, then choose to leave it in others' hands? And yet others faded behind embroidered curtains, like Empress Dowager Cixi of China, whose power was immense, yet shielded behind a screen. She made decisions from behind gauze, ruled from shadow, but even the forbidden city could not forbid mortality. Her final edicts were signed as her breath shortened, and the incense in her chambers drifted upward in spirals, carrying names, hopes, regrets. The woman who controlled an empire with a glance left no words of farewell. Only the soft creak of a closing screen, and the smell of lotus petals curling in on themselves. Then there was Napoleon, whose dreams frankly never quite accepted the idea of an ending. His battles had carved up continents, his ambitions redefined maps. But it wasn't to be a death on the battlefield. It was to be a death in exile on a wet island, buffeted by wind, with only a few loyal companions, and the memory of Europe echoing in his ears. The man who once crowned himself emperor kissed a picture of his son before sleeping over and over, as if the gesture alone could undo his distance, his mistakes, his mortality. It couldn't. Nothing could. And in all these stories, in the whispers, and the candlelight in the bedsheets and rustling gowns, you begin to see a pattern. The final days of kings and queens are not so different from yours or mine. They are in many ways stripped of the ceremony they once embodied. The crowns are set aside, the titles lose their teeth, and what remains are questions. Did I do enough? Did I love rightly? Will I be remembered? And if so, for what historians argue? endlessly about legacies. Some say it's policy that matters. Others insist it's personality. But very few mention that final hour, that moment, when the noise stops and the silence arrives not as a void, but as a presence. A closing breath that fills the room more fully than any decree ever could. What would it feel like, you wonder, to hold that silence? To rest your hands on the end of an empire, to hear your name spoken in past tense for the first time? Would it sting or soothe? Would it feel like failure or freedom? And the truth is, no script can answer that. Not even the most carefully crafted bedtime story can thread that final needle. What we can do, however, is witness. We can listen gently to the silence left behind. We can walk through these last rooms with soft steps, holding reverence for the quiet rather than fear. And we can remember that whether you ruled over kingdoms or merely your own corner of the world, you too will leave a silence behind. What matters is what kind of music plays just before. So here we are, dear listener, at the end not just of this story, but of many. You've wandered across centuries tonight, brushed past coronation robes, and rusted swords touched the lace cuffs of dying monarchs, peeked into rooms too private for courtiers. And now it's time to let them rest. Let the crowns gather dust. Let the portraits crack and fade. Let history fold in on itself like parchment left in the sun, not because it no longer matters, but because even stories must sleep. Take a breath with me now, a long one. Let your shoulders drop just a little. Let your thoughts drift like incense through a palace corridor. You've seen how it ends again and again, with candles, with quiet, with questions that may never be answered. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's the gift, not the tragedy. The space left behind by power is the one we can fill with reflection, with empathy, with soft understanding. The night is quiet now. Let it be. Let the kings and queens rest. Let your own heart slow. Sweet dreams.